The Vanishing Room, a mystery no one can explain. The door that wasn't there yesterday. Leona arrived at Aldwych House with a clipboard, a tape measure, and a practiced belief that buildings obeyed rulers. The third-floor corridor disagreed. Paint the color of tired eucalyptus stretched along a spine of creaking boards and hissing radiators, and the air carried the faint fragrance of camphor and boiled rain. She measured wall lengths between units 309 and 311, logged widths of skirting, and marked hairline fractures where plaster was learning to speak. When the tape recoiled and clicked against what should have been empty wall, she looked up and found a door that had not existed a blink earlier. It was matte black, narrow, and unnumbered, with a keyhole too small for any key she knew, a seam so precise it looked more like a paused breath than an opening, and 3 neat tally marks at the base, as if someone had been patient in counting. She tested the wood with her palm and felt the coolness of something that had decided to be real. Blueprints she carried showed only a wall. Ink ignored the possibility of this black rectangle. The corridor seemed to lengthen in acknowledgement, as if making room for a thought. Leona cataloged the oddities because cataloging was her faith. The paint around the frame was marginally newer, as if a concealed bruise had been touched up. The skirting held a pale smear like dried tears and varnish. The air bent inward, not a breeze, but the polite lean of a crowd when a curtain flutters. Her habit was to set rules when a space stopped behaving. She looped bright paracord around a radiator and her waist, tugged the line until it sang, and kept the door ajar with a boot heel. When she knocked, something inside the wood answered with a delicate tap, as though fingers drummed a desk to a private rhythm. Writing became the only acceptable experiment. She uncapped a marker and left the simplest claim a human can offer: a mystery. I see you. The ink bled and vanished, absorbed in a grain like rain into stone. She wrote her name next, and the letters held. Then, with a reluctance shaped like etiquette, the door replied in condensation, drafting words the way mist draws on mirrors. Yes. She asked if it was a room, and it admitted what its shape already suggested. She asked what it took, and it wrote with a patient certainty that felt older than paint. Things that hurt. That assertion reoriented the hallway. If a space could bear pain the way a beam bears weight, then perhaps the strange disappearances whispered about Aldwych House, an orderly nurse during the old influenza, a violin teacher, a man who went out for milk in 1972 were not abductions, but consequences of bargains. Rumor offered names. The wall now offered a premise. Leona stepped back from the threshold, took stock of the light pooling without visible source, and realized the room behaved as if it were designed for therapy and confession. She had read footnotes about a Dr. Elias Fun, architect of conversions after the war, who argued for rooms as interventions and once sought funding for a vanishing annex that would help patients deposit trauma where no one had to keep tripping over it. The board had called his proposal morally unsound. The third-floor corridor, with its door that appeared at 3 and changed at 4, suggested he had built what he could not officially name. Her first entry into the space was a careful crossing. The room was larger than the corridor allowed, which meant the corridor had been measuring itself wrong. The light was kind but precise, landing without shadows, as if it preferred honesty to drama. Walls breathed in a gray-green calm. Floorboards held the polish of many slow footsteps, and the air layered lemon oil with wool and a far-off thread of rosin, as though a lost violin note were practicing persistence in the bones. On the wall opposite the door, a list had been written inside the paint itself rather than on it. Names appeared in an order that belonged to urgency rather than time. Nurse Alma K. Mr. Jonathan Pike. Milk, Iris and Ivy. H. Left-handed. Elias Fun. A name. The last line did not accuse. It ached, an empty outline for whatever could not be spoken. Leona tested the room's promise by offering a small, bearable shard. The sound of her mother's cough at night, when doctors were too expensive and childhood had to learn the price of air. The room shifted as if finding a better angle to hold the weight, and the list accepted the new line with the practical grace of a ledger. L.S. mother's cough. Leona felt a subtraction at her sternum, a clean hole where something heavy had been keeping poor time. It was not erasure. It was relief with memory. In the corner, floor grooves recorded long, soft arcs, as if a chair had been dragged back and forth and indecision. Chalk dust in the grooves tasted slightly of salt, reminding her that grief crystallizes when it dries. The doorway had narrowed by a finger's width when she turned to leave, the first hint of the hour when the room's appetite changed. For a clock had been described as hunger, though it seemed to thicken as if it had been rained on from the inside. At the outer frame, a message pressed hard in graphite waited like counsel. If you come back, bring someone who remembers differently. That prescription matched the logic of a place that dealt in competing narratives. If pain becomes truer when a chorus confirms its edges, then a room that eats hurt might prefer a choir to a solo. Leona returned to the corridor and made practical choices. She found Elora Pike, granddaughter of the man who went for milk and never stepped back onto ordinary floors. Elora kept a shoebox of the neighborhood's unsolved sentences, a brittle clipping that read "Neighborhood man disappears. Milk arrives anyway," a receipt whose ink thinned where grief had touched it too often, a theater stub that had outlived its performance. She spoke like a person who had learned to be accurate to survive other people's stories about her family. The plan that formed required attention tied to safety, a length of cord braided through wrists and railings, a sequence for entering and leaving, a compact with curiosity so it would not become recklessness. The corridor extended itself, unafraid of spectators. Neighbors gathered with tokens of memory, a nurse who could recite procedures from wards that smelled like bleach and prayer, a math teacher whose mother had been one half of twins distinguished only by the angle of their lies, a man who once loved someone forever called left-handed, and the building's janitor who held his sorrow like a mop, useful, worn, and immediately to hand. When the door presented itself again at 3, it did not gasp or grandstand. It simply introduced its seemed to air as though that act were a courtesy. Leona uncoiled the cord, bound herself to the hall, and opened a threshold that had the manners of an elevator. The room received the chorus. On the wall, under the ledger of names, a neat space waited as a blank plate waits for food. The nurse left a cap, and the air remembered starch. The math teacher left chalk, and the grooves acknowledged practice. Elora set a milk bottle cap at the threshold like a coin laid on a fairy plank, and the floor kissed it with condensation. When she asked not with lips, but with posture for a shape of truth that did not punish her grandfather for being taken, the room shifted again. The list did not apologize. It drew a bottle beside Jonathan's name and wrote sorrow with a finer point. The building learned a new sound that afternoon, a hum braided from fluorescent ballast, and a violin finding its stubborn note. It signaled the hour when the room's edges grew sharper. The doorway narrowed and then held, as if the space understood it had been trusted. On the skirting just beyond the door's reach, chalk wrote a small warning in a hand Leona recognized without admitting why. Don't. The message fell like a pebble in a deep well and took a long time to be heard. When the door smoothed back into wall, the corridor exhaled the way lungs do after holding back a thought. Leona carried out with her a grain of salt, the curve of a bottle cap's rim, and the certainty that she had stepped into a design that remembered, contained, and occasionally kept what had been offered. The mystery was not whether the room existed. The mystery was what it demanded in exchange for relief, and whether those who bargained could remain themselves after a fair trade. Chapter 2, The Annex and the Shape of What Remains. The next day, the building wore attention like a tailored coat. People came not to gawk, but to practice remembrance. A pattern assembled itself. The door formed at 3 with a calm that rejected spectacle. At 4, the grain of the wood gathered and appetite sharpened. Between those stations, something like governance could be attempted. Elora arrived with determination layered under grief. Mr. Harrow with buttons correctly aligned and paracord tied to his wrist like a promise, and Leona with the measured alertness of someone who had found the exact border between wonder and risk. The wall opened to them as before, its seam returning as if it had only stepped out for air. Inside, the light had changed tonality to winter, paler, cleaner, as though someone had washed the window of sky they could not see. The list of names remained and had gained a date below Harrow's stalled entry. The room had done what most confessions do when permitted time. It had chosen a marker. The new number gave grief a rung to stand on and a year to lean against, which made crying possible in the way a chair makes sitting possible. Elora proposed terms to a space that had swallowed generations without paperwork. If rooms take what they're given, then the people who give can write rules into their offering. The bargain requested was simple and exacting. Let us visit without losing ourselves. Let us leave weight without being eaten. Take names only when freely surrendered. The room considered, and its method of reply was architectural rather than verbal. A narrow interior door arrived within the room, white-painted, with a small panel of frosted glass and a brass plate that waited the way a quiet stage waits for the first footfall. Beyond the new door sat a corridor like the inside of a seam. Empty frames lined the walls. Air there tasted of paper warmed by sunlight and the metallic edge of old picture hooks, patient and ready. The brass plate accepted a name when offered. When Leona slid into a frame the grocery receipt where Mr. Harrow had tried to write notes that would not stay in any official ledger, the plate softened and took letters like hot wax, taking a signet. Harrow, notes, incomplete, 1991 to 1992. The annex had taught itself a rule. It preserved tokens that knew their own meaning and refused to hunger after the bodies of the people attached. Elora placed the milk bottle cap, and a faint ring appeared under glass the way pond water rings when a coin settles. The nurse offered a white cap and watched starch turn into memory you could look at without swallowing. The math teacher rested a chalkboard eraser, and the frame gathered the ghost of equations that had once steadied a roomful of doubt. Objects entered, held their stories, and did not require a person for ballast. The main wall seemed to relax. Copper in the air receded to glass. The violin lost less of its note. The room did not pretend to be omnipotent. It wrote politely that it took what it was given. It wrote awkwardly that sometimes the hurt and the person refused to let go of each other. It wrote that it would try to accept the new terms. Try is a sober word. A science of living is built from attempts. Mr. Harrow agreed to the experiment with the courage of a man who had been forgetting in order to function and was willing to remember to live. He reached the place on the wall where his unnamed boy had begun to emerge as a shadowy graphite and asked for a precise operation. Take the ache of his laugh and leave me the laugh. The sound itself unhooked from its breaking edge. The room shifted its balance. Salt in the grooves rose like a tide at a new moon and settled. And under the line that could not write a name, a small drawn hand appeared, left-handed and open. Harrow sobbed once. A clear sound like a glass set down after shaking and breathed a new kind of air. The annex taught the neighborhood to practice offerings. People arrived weekly. A florist framed a pressed daisy from a bedside they could not otherwise visit. A retired ward sister framed a bell cord cut from a demolished ward and smiled like a person who had finally found a drawer that fit. A young man framed a map torn from a bus timetable that had once taken him away from someone he could not bear to leave. He kept the leaving and left the regret. An older woman framed a theater stub for a show she had seen with someone who became a stranger. She decided to remember the music without the corrosion. The wall did not eat. The frames did not haunt. The corridor learned to smell like ink and lemon mixed. The perfume of paper people have touched with intention. Fame, that excitable and useless animal, visited the story and then ran off barking at something else. What remained was a practice, third-floor visits, careful tethering, decisions made in plain light that did not demand a body as a sacrament. Leona documented carefully, voice steady, sentences disciplined so they could be read aloud without snagging. The camera learned which angles did not insult the mystery by pretending to solve it. Viewers sent messages that ranged from bewildered gratitude to flinty skepticism. Both kinds were welcome because both acknowledged the room's premise, which was not to prove itself but to hold what it could. Leona carried her own instruction like an ember, the chalk under the skirting whispering don't. She had begun to recognize what that prohibition guarded. There's a kind of hurt so entangled with a person's making that to ask a room to take it would be to ask the room to take the person as well. The shame she had cultivated like a houseplant over a choice on a hospital day when exams and fevers demanded adult arithmetic of a young woman had become part of the architecture that kept her precise and gentle. She could sand its edges without removing the beam. She could forgive herself in a corridor without offering that forgiveness as currency to a hungry space. She tried, quietly, in front of an ordinary wall that did not write back, and the air stayed air, which meant she had chosen to carry the remainder herself. That weight stopped gnawing and started balancing. The room seemed to approve by changing in tandem. A message appeared and faded like sunlight at noon. I change when you do. The sentence set the mystery properly. The vanishing room was not a fixed trap, but a responsive instrument. It preferred to work with what was given freely. It could become a kinder container if people became kinder narrators of their own histories. It still had edges. Once, a man tried to donate the pattern of lying that had threaded his marriage. Frost appeared along a brass plate, a band of refusal, and he stepped back, choosing to keep his ring and learn a better practice in a different room. Boundaries held. Terms lived. Winter softened into a season where the hallway paint looked like new leaves. The annex frames gained a small constellation of labels with dates and first names, and sometimes a single initial for what would not be said aloud. People did not vanish anymore when they came to make offerings, and yet the corridor learned to feel like a place where absences could be named without swallowing a whole life. Elora moved through the space like a keeper who issues neither orders nor apologies. She understood that stewardship is a rhythm, not a rule. Mr. Harrow polished baseboards weekly and left a fresh daisy at the chalked warning, which resisted every damp cloth as if stubbornness were its job. Leona's footage captured not miracles but maintenance. Knots tied, frames straightened, plates engraved, breaths released, and the steady practice of saying thank you before leaving. On a winter afternoon marked 2025 by the building's new habit of remembering dates, Leona walked the annex loop and paused before a brass plate that read a name, returned, 2025. The frame held only her reflection in its glass. There was no sudden reappearance, no handwriting formed by mist. The lesson presented itself without letters. Some names do not need to be spoken to be kept. Some losses are not to be reversed, but to be witnessed into gentleness. She smiled at the room the way you smile at an old friend who does not need your performance to understand you. On the main wall, beside the small, Rye welcomed back the space like to display when it was feeling companionable. She left a final inscription in pencil, low and almost hidden, 2 words that do not demand and cannot be swallowed. Thank you. The letters did not vanish or glow. They held like a note sustained in a good room, audible without fatigue. Aldwych House, when observed from the street, returned to being brick, lintel, glass, post, and cornice. From the stairs, it was riser and tread, and the scuff patterns where Liv changed their minds. For the third-floor corridor, it was wall smell, radiator hiss, and the precise seam of a door that knows when it is wanted and when it should be absent. The mystery no one could explain became the practice many could keep. The vanishing room remained itself, a place designed to take hurt shaped for holding, a place that occasionally held people who could not untangle from their pain, a place that learned restraint when asked properly, and a place that reminded everyone who entered that architecture is not only what you build out of wood and nail, but also what you agree to carry in your chest. If you stood long enough with your hand on the skirting, you could feel the faintest hum of a violin finishing its lost note and settling the bow. If you knocked, the door might admit you. If you wrote on the paint, the wall might answer with good manners. If you stayed within the rules you had made and honored the warning with your own initial, you could leave lighter without losing yourself. The vanishing room had not ended. It had learned to stay.